Our opening prayer has the priest, on behalf of the people, praying that God will give us the help and grant us the grace so that we would have a reverence for the most holy body and blood of Christ, such that we would experience its effects. So I want to share with you some examples of people who had reverence for the Eucharist, reverence for Jesus, this gift, miraculous gift, right, of him giving of himself through the Eucharist in particular, such that they had Eucharistic courage, Eucharistic clarity, Eucharistic ingenuity, and Eucharistic charity. So I want to have us think on that and meditate on that. Courage, clarity, ingenuity, and charity. The courage. And I will say this actually just as one example of the power of Jesus' loving gift of himself in the Eucharist, perpetuating his presence in us and in the church and in the world, that these stories take us from the 4th century to the 13th century to the 20th and 21st centuries, up right to our time. So the first story is from the year 304 under the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Our priest who introduced this story to a group of us priests recently, he used a very stark image that Diocletian at the time would have been, in his stance toward Christians, equivalent to Hitler and the Nazis, to Jewish, in particular, people. Diocletian's final solution to try to get rid of Christianity. And so one thing he decreed was that all around the Roman Empire, where there were Christians who were known to gather on Sunday for what they called the Lord's Day, and has evolved into what we call the Mass, but that wherever they were meeting, they were to be rounded up and made to either denounce Christ, reject their Christianity, or be killed. And if they didn't do it right away, the renunciation, they would be tortured to try to get them to do so. So in this region or town in Africa, which is now in modern-day Tunisia, and even for the recording, I apologize, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but I believe it's Abitanai is the name of this town or city in the Roman province of Africa. The Roman military official there apparently had a soft heart and respect and friendship for the Christians, and so he warned them. The next time you're going to meet at one of their houses, I would presume it was one of the more well-off Christians who offered his house over for them to meet on Sundays for the Lord's Day. As I say, but now we call the Mass, but of course the whole day is the Lord's Day all Sunday, but they called the gathering itself too, like the Lord's Day gathering. He warned them, look, I have orders. Anybody who comes here tomorrow, where I heard the story, he was saying tomorrow. Anybody who comes at so-and-so's house for your Sunday gathering, the next time, I and my soldiers, we have to storm and invade that house and gather you all up, and you will be taken to either reject your Christianity and renounce Christ or be killed. So please, keep yourself safe. Hide. And that's what he apparently thought himself. He saw himself doing them a favor out of his friendship for them and his respect for them. And they said, thank you for that warning. We'll take it into consideration. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing, of course. So that next Lord's Day, there was a group of 49. They gathered for Mass, what we would call gathered for Mass, to be able to encounter Jesus in the Scriptures and in the Eucharist and in one another, including young people. I don't know if they were teenagers or young adults, but so it was the priest and 48 people who showed up. And their friend, the Roman guy, had to arrest them. Somewhere along the line, one of them was asked, well, didn't you have this warning? What was going to happen if you came and did this thing? And he said, this is a paraphrase of a translation into English. He said, without the Lord's day, we cannot exist. Life itself, existence itself, is meaningless and pointless without the Mass and the Eucharist in our lives. Some of the younger women, their older brothers, I gather, who either were Christian but had already done their renunciation or weren't Christian, tried to stand up for them and say, oh, they're just being manipulated by these people. They don't really know what they're doing. Let them go free. But they stood up for themselves and said, no, we believe in Christ. We are committed to our identity as Christians. We do this out of our free will. And they willingly went along with everyone else, who, all of them, eventually were killed out of their reverence and devotion and dedication to the Mass and to the Eucharist in particular. And obviously, foundational to all that, their commitment to Christ. They had Eucharistic courage and zeal. May the Lord stir that up in us as well. So now fast forward to the late 1200s, 1263. A German priest, Father Peter, was having, I understand, genuine, authentic struggle of doubt, of belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So he went on pilgrimage, and I'm gathering it was to try to work this out and to help, ask God's help to free him of these doubts, which is something I would suggest, I suggest this to myself when I do this, and to all of us. When we have doubts about any teaching of the church, when any doctrine strikes us as wrong, or we disagree with the church teaches on X, Y, or Z, rather than assuming we're correct and the church is wrong and the church needs to change, let's bring it to the Lord. Let's be humble like Father Peter, if I'm correct, that he went on this pilgrimage to submit to the Lord his doubts and ask God's help to clear things up for him. Give the church and its teachings and its doctrines and its disciplines the benefit of the doubt, I would say. So Peter did that, and boy, did God answer his prayers. He was saying Mass during this pilgrimage, and according to this account, saying Mass, he had barely spoken the words of consecration when blood began to seep from the consecrated host over his hands onto the corporal and the altar cloth. Eventually, it led to him bringing this to the attention of the Pope at the time, Pope Urban IV, who was residing in the neighboring city of Orvieto. And I'll leave out a lot of details. But the Pope initially had other people go and investigate, then the Pope himself encountered the altar cloth or the corporal, one or the other, that had this blood on it. And they investigated it and determined its authenticity. Now, the priest who told us this story, he said some pope gave permission to have the relics, which still have some of that blood, from 1263. Had it analyzed, and it is blood type is AB, which is the universal recipient. Do that what you will, as far as meditate on that. And also, I'll say this as an aside. Well, actually, not as an aside. As an important thing to consider. Among other things, God deciding to do this miracle, to have actual blood emanate from a host, is a reminder to us that in the Blessed Sacrament, in the host itself, Jesus gives all of himself to us, body, blood, soul, and divinity. So in times such as now, after many centuries of it being the case, where the faithful were not receiving the precious blood, be encouraged and keep in mind you receive the grace and the reality of the blood of Christ in the host, as well as in the precious blood when it's able to be distributed. So no one is missing out on the fullness of the Eucharist when times bring about receiving the Blessed Sacrament. It's body, blood, soul, and divinity. Jesus gives himself to us. So after Pope Urban IV had all this investigated, and I'm presuming he prayed and everything else he did, one result was the next year, 1264, Pope Urban IV introduced and established the feast of the most holy body and blood of Christ. This very feast that we're celebrating today started in 1264 because God wanted to help one of his priests come back to full belief and have Eucharistic clarity, and brought about that Eucharistic miracle. Let's give ourselves over to the Lord. Say, Lord, whatever it takes, or whatever you want to say to me about anything, bring it on, Lord. Convince me. Help me understand you more. Help me love and embrace all that our family of faith professes and teaches more. Help me enter more fully into the mystery of all the sacraments, and particularly the Eucharist. Get Eucharistic clarity. And now fast forward to our times. In London in 1991, an Italian family, and the mom gave birth to a little boy named Carlo. And the family name is Acutis. Carlo Acutis, born 1991 in London, but the family was Italian, and soon they moved back to Italy, to Milan. His mother admits that when Carlo was born in 1991, she, Catholic Italian woman, had been to church 3 times. Her baptism, her confirmation, and her wedding. So this was not an actively devout Catholic family. But Carlo was blessed by God doing something in his little life. And when he was a boy, I'm thinking maybe his grandmother took him to church, to Mass. But something happened that he fell in love with the Mass and was fascinated by the Eucharist and what God was doing. So much so that he, I'm sure, respectfully pestered the parish priest to let him take classes and receive communion early. So a year before he was supposed to, by whatever procedures they had in Italy at the time, he received Holy Communion a year early and attended daily Mass thereafter. He loved the saints. He cared for the homeless each night. He made regular pilgrimages to Assisi, prayed the rosary daily. And he had Eucharistic ingenuity, in that as a young man, born in 1991, he really wanted to help other people know Jesus and know how wondrous and glorious and joyful and how much strength you can receive in times of normal human struggle and grief and hardship and sadness. Through all areas of life, to know Jesus was the greatest joy he experienced, and to receive Jesus in the Eucharist. And so he got very ardent about trying to get his high school classmates to know Jesus, to, if they were Catholic, to attend Mass, to give their lives to Christ. He taught little kids. He helped to convert his mother, who became a more active Christian because of him. And his ingenuity is that he started a website to catalog all the Eucharistic miracles he could find through history and all around the world, so that people could know the glory of what Jesus does in giving himself to us in the Eucharist. And then he is now beatified. because, excuse me, he contracted a fatal disease, and he died at the age of 15, 2006. And he's already beatified. He's had one miracle attributed to him that I think took place in Brazil. So he's blessed Carlo Acutis. Eucharistic ingenuity and Eucharistic charity embodied in him. He said, among other things, to be always united to Jesus is my program of life. Keep in mind, he was 15 when he died. He said, happiness comes from keeping, quote, one's face turned toward God, close quote. And then paraphrasing, sadness comes from focusing your attention on yourself. He once said, every minute that passes is 1 minute less to become like God. And to become like God was his desire. It didn't make sense to him, this writer says, that people would go in huge crowds to soccer games or rock concerts, but no lines were before tabernacles where God is present and lives among us. He called the Eucharist his highway to heaven and attended daily Mass from the time he was 7. His Eucharistic ingenuity and Eucharistic charity is an example for us to figure out how can we come to know Christ more, become more like Christ, and do whatever we can with our skills, our talents, our temperament, our personality to help other people come to know Jesus and to lead Eucharistic lives that would draw us closer to God and draw other people to want to know God. May the Lord, through the power and grace of his life, his presence in the Eucharist, his most holy body and precious blood, help us to have Eucharistic courage, Eucharistic clarity, Eucharistic ingenuity, Eucharistic charity, and above all, to lead full throttle, beautiful, amazing Eucharistic lives.